In this video, we'll be using the feather texture we've created in the previous video, as well as other CurveSuite modifiers to create a feathered wing. Here I have a base Blender scene. To start off, I will get rid of all the objects in it, as well as our timeline window because we won't be needing it. I'll add in a plain object and name it feather because this will be our feathers. I'll create a new shader editor window and assign a new material, call it feather. I'll bring in an image texture node, and then I will open our feather texture. I'll plug in the color and alpha slots. I will set the blend and shadow mode to be alpha clip. We'll move this aside for now. And in our asset browser window, I will add in a Bezier object. And then I will add in our modifiers to it. To start off, I will be adding in the bridge curves with subcurves modifier. And in edit mode, I will duplicate our curve object. I'll shrink down our curve object's radius a little bit. I will add in our deformed array along curves modifier. Now select our feathers object for the object parameter of this modifier. And I will name our curve object wings, because this will be our wings. I'll shrink down the X scale until there is no overlap between the deformed array along curves generated planes. And we immediately have this problem where the plane object just has its default UV map, where the texture is 3 feathers. And to fix this, we can use this scrambled UVs modifier. And underneath the parameters, because we have 3 feather variations along the x-axis, the x count parameter will be 3. And because we have no different variations along the y direction, the y count will be 1. So now each plane gets only 1 feather texture. I want there to be some variation, the orientation of these feathers, so I will be adding in a displace curves modifier and place it before our scramble UVs and deformed array along curves, which has highlighted a problem for us where the displace curves modifiers normally displaces the tip of our curve objects, whereas with the feathers it's displacing the root part, so the image texture is reversed. So one way to fix this is to go into edit mode and scale on the y axis by -1. You can control the x-axis or the count of each feather along the length of our curves using the count parameter of the bridge curves with subcurves modifier. And as for the density of the feathers along the length of the feathers, we have this count parameter for our deformed array along curves, but we can see once we adjust this, the feathers have this noticeable visible gap in between them. And if we enable wireframe mode, we can see even though the planes that are being generated are immediately preceding one another, there is no gap. Visually there still is. The deformed array along curves modifier stacks these objects with no gap in between one another, but also no overlap. So what I'm going to do is set the count to 1 instead, and underneath curve generation, we can use split curve to curves. I will place it before our displaced curves, and I will hide our displaced curves for now, so we get a better idea of what it is doing. Here we have the root and tip overextension parameters, and because they are negative values, once this modifier is cutting the curves into multiple curves, they get these gaps in between. So if we set these values to be positive instead, they will actually overlap, which is what we want. There is a bit of Z fighting here, so I will go into edit mode on our feather object, and while this step isn't really mandatory, we can fix this in other ways. I will add in some edge loops. And another thing these edge loops provide, other than just helping fix the Z fighting, is once we enable our displace curves modifier and toy around with the parameters a little bit, because these planes now have more vertices, the displace curves modifier has more to work with. So these aren't just flat planes anymore. They can be displaced in such ways that there is even more variety between each feather. Now I'll try and edit these curves in edit mode to make this wing look more like a wing. This would be much easier with visual reference. So when you're working on your own wings, feel free to find and use some. For now I will try to get a rough outline going on without any reference images because I do not want to risk using copyrighted material. One important thing to note while we're working on edit mode is because we have this wing set up so that it is mostly flat on the XY plane, we're not really running into any issues regarding the normals of the curves, but if we were to rotate it by 90 degrees on the x-axis, you can see the orientation of the feathers gets a bit weird. This is because of how Blender calculates the twist of the curves, where the closer the curve's tangent is to the object space z-axis, more prone it is to spinning around wildly. So I recommend working with the XY plane when trying to line up your wings, or alternatively you can use the align curve to surface modifier and create a rough surface as the template for the curved normals to be aligned to. You can, if you want, work in edit mode like this, with the XY plane being your main focus, but in object mode, if you rotate by 90 degrees, as long as the object space z-axis is perpendicular to your wing, so to speak, you will be fine. This is also another good opportunity to highlight how the ordering of these modifiers affects the underlying geometry. If we mute deformed array along curves, we get an image of the curves that the displaced curves is actually displacing. And because we have our bridge curves with subcurves followed by split curves followed by displaced curves, displacement is happening on these tiny snippets of curves. Whereas if we move displaced curves above it, the displacement will happen on these curves generated by bridge curves with subcurves. You can see how subtle the effect is. So one thing this means is we can actually have two different layers of displacement. We have two separate modifiers, one before our split curve to curves and one after it. This can be useful if you want a messier looking wing. As a final example of what you can do, I will create a duplicate of our wing object, because you may find the range of editing you can perform with just these control points a bit limiting. If you want, you could actually use more curves within this edit mode to create more control points to let you create more small edits on the shape of the wing. But one thing you can do is actually delete that one and create a new copy from the unedited version. At any point of this modifier stack, you can actually apply the modifiers and work from there. For example, with the bridge curves with subcurves, we have these curves generated. And maybe you want to make fine-tune adjustments on these curves. I'll create another copy of this just for now. And you can actually convert this object back to mesh. Unfortunately, you cannot apply these modifiers to curve objects. And you can't convert a curve object back to a curve object. So what we have to do is first convert to mesh and then convert back to curve. And you have these curve points that we can edit. And then we can just copy the modifiers that we had disabled back to our new object. And the result should be identical with the modifiers applied, but we can actually edit these curves individually now. So for example, we could reduce the scale of the feathers in parts where the curves are more dense, or increase them in areas where they're not so dense to cover any gaps. We can even control the tilt of the curves to angle the feathers. Or make small scale adjustments to the individual curves. This is all up to you. You could even just leave bridge curves with subcurves and then split curve to curves. Or you can even have the displaced curves left on and then convert to mesh and then back to curve. And then copy our deformed array curves and scramble the UVs back to our object. And make edits on the actual scrambled and split version of the object, where you can see each curve is one feather. You can still make large scale adjustments as long as we have the connected only tick box disabled in the proportional editing panel. This is one of the great strengths of this modifier-based workflow where you can actually just use these modifiers to the extent that you want them to and just apply them at any point you want where you think that having access to the actual edit mode functionality would be stronger than having access to the procedural editing provided by these modifiers. So I should mention that these generated objects or these generated feathers retain pretty much every attribute of our initial feather object. So unless you set shade smooth, these will have flat shading. And if you have a single feather object, you could even do edits here. That would be more suited for a singular feather texture, for example. And as long as you keep that in mind, you can come back from pretty much any edit or make any adjustments on the fly. You could even change the feather texture at any point. Or if you're not happy with the fact that we've added in these edge loops, you could go into edit mode and add in a new plane object, for example, and get rid of the old one. I hope this highlights what is possible and what can be done with these modifiers and the points during which you can choose to stop relying on them and to apply them so you get more control in edit mode. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or contact me directly.